Shields and swords, field of wars, fighting my blood down to the core. Warriors from medieval age, fear the reign of night brigades. Crusades into the room, moving through the temples and tombs. Scared and placed, prepare to face Professor Awesome and the minions of doom. 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 Professor Awesome and the minions of doom.
Hi, minions. So in art, there's a concept, especially narrative art, called a foil. Now you can have it in visual art as well, and other sorts of art forms. But the idea of a foil is it's two kinds of characters, or two characters, and the two characters will have attributes that contrast the two characters, and yet then emphasize the same attributes in the other character. So I like to often use examples of superheroes and superhero stories because I think they're pretty easy to understand. So one kind of foil is the hero and the sidekick. And the purpose of the sidekick, you'll note most of the time a hero's sidekick has similar abilities or similar powers. They're just not quite as good as the hero is. And so essentially what the sidekick offers for the reader or the viewer is the sense of, well, if the hero were not as good, what would that look like? And so it really emphasizes the heroicness of the protagonist, the main character. Now, there's also the contrast between a hero and a villain. This is another very common kind, right? Where they're opposing one another, and yet in opposing one another, we see this emphasizes the greater heroicness of the hero and the evilness of the villain. And so, of course, very often you'll see that a villain in maybe a comic book or some kind of action film will just be another version of the hero. One example I like of this that's not from comic books is James Bond. If you look at James Bond villains, they're pretty similar to James Bond, or at least the person he's pretending to be as he's going out on his mission. They are wealthy, they're brilliant, they are all the things that James Bond is, but they are evil. And so because of their greatness, James Bond acts in opposition to them. And if he were just, stopping not super wealthy guys who have, bases on the moon, but just some schmo, he'd still be a hero, but the level of heroism would be sort of tamped down. And so those are two common kinds where they are kind of together and they are apart. Now, another kind of foil, though, is the buddy foil, where there are two people who, we see this a lot, like in buddy cop films, for example. There are two characters, and these two characters are not in opposition to one another. There isn't one who is the obvious superior to the other, but each one of them occupies a space that is almost not a complete human being, right? So like one is methodical but overly uptight, and so can't improvise. The other one is intuitive, isn't able to improvise, but they're not disciplined, and so unable to achieve their goals. And when you take these two very different kinds together, you put them together, then they create whatever you want the protagonist to be able to do. The act of heroism in a buddy cop film, for example. And I think one way to read these kinds of foils, where you've got two people who are not in opposition to one another, one's not the superior to the other one necessarily, is as if these two foils are, as if they're two halves of the same person, as if each one is an incomplete person and needs the other one to complete them in some way. Almost as if the writer took a character, chopped them in half and said, okay, this will be this side of the character, and that will be the other side of the character, and we will embody them separately. All right, So already, since I want to talk to you about the Epic of Gilgamesh, you should already probably be guessing what I'm thinking about, which is one way of reading Gilgamesh and Enkidu is not as separate characters, but almost as if they are the same person, almost as if they each need the other one to be a complete person. Enkidu is animalistic, covered in hair. They need a hunter to figure out or a trapper to figure out a hunter to figure out how to trap him, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right? Gilgamesh is associated with the city. Uruk is his city. Right? He is in every way connected with the city itself, and so there's the idea of man who is civilized in Gilgamesh and man who is natural in Enkidu. And we see from the very beginning that even though Gilgamesh has total mastery over the city, the people cry out to the gods because he's a terrible leader. They don't like him as a king. He's terrible to his people. He's effective, but he's awful. So when Enkidu comes around, he does transform Gilgamesh, doesn't defeat him the way the gods had intended, but it still comes out well. Essentially, partly what Enkidu is doing in this is he is bringing to Gilgamesh the other side of himself that he should be considering. And once Enkidu and Gilgamesh are together and they're able to act together, they're able to act within the city, they're able to go out and like fight Humbaba. They have these kind of moral debates about what to do about Humbaba. Like, is he worth, why are we doing this? Should we fight for glory? And those kinds of debates, we see that Gilgamesh and Enkidu are sort of as if they are two halves of the same person and trying to come to a completeness as this person, right? Obviously, this is all interpretive. They're not really in the narrative two different one person. They're two people in the narrative. So then, when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh, when he encounters this, it is for Gilgamesh truly a kind of sense that part of himself has died, because in a way Enkidu is part of himself. And so the quest he goes on, when Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is back in the same position he was in before Enkidu was created and came to him, before he ever fought Enkidu. So when he dies, now Gilgamesh feels the hole in himself, and he goes on his quest for immortality, thinking that that's going to fill the hole in himself. And of course, it's not able to do that, and he ultimately has to return to the city and ultimately becomes a good king, partly because of the lessons he has learned. And so even though Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh is able to develop as a fully formed person. And so I'm using this not just to interpret the Epic of Gilgamesh, but to suggest to you that whenever you see a kind of narrative, whether it's a story or a or a movie or whatever it is, where there are two characters who are acting in concert together, but they are opposites. One way to think about that is, what is it saying about if those characters were one person? What are the two conflicting sides of someone? And how do those two conflicting sides, Jekyll and Hyde style, fight to figure out what is the best way to proceed? And in essence, whenever you do this, you're kind of suggesting that for someone to truly succeed, they really need to engage both sides of themselves, regardless of how the artist has split that up in the narrative.